What does one promise mean across 20 years of chains? Two men led Clara forward with hands that did not look like hands belonging to neighbors. They moved her as if she were a thing sold and resold. She did not scream. She could not. There was no sound left for that. Instead, her fingers found her daughter's raw and small, and she squeezed until the pulse in the child's wrist thudded under her grip. The market's dust hung in the heat. Voices rose and fell like a distant tide. Clara leaned close enough for Cândida to feel her breath, and in a voice that trembled with both fury and tenderness, she asked for what she could still give. A promise. Keep them together. Keep them alive. Do not let them be sold apart. 20 years later, on a farm called São Benedito, the promise sat heavy inside Cândida like an iron coin in a pocket, cold, weighty, unbreakable. The bell of São Benedito was not a bell of celebration. It was a metronome of labor. It called people from sleep before light, clanging across rows of coffee trees and waking men with its hard insistence. It tolled for work, for meals taken from a bowl in the yard, for punishments for the opening and closing of days measured in harvests. For 200 people who lived on that land, the bell kept time like a clock of chains. São Benedito lay on a slope of dark soil and rows that curled away into the horizon. Coffee leaves smelled like a green, bitter sea after rain. The air carried the damp of sweat and the acrid tang of smoke from cooking fires. The Senzala, the long wooden barracks that housed the enslaved people, breathed its own kind of tiredness. Low doors, quilts hung like flags of endurance, a constant faint ache of bodies leaning into the next day's work. Cândida knew every crack in its floorboards, every whisper required to keep a secret. She moved through the farm as both eye and shadow, a kitchen keeper, a midwife of bread and beans, guardian of small things that could mean survival. The handful of roasted coffee beans kept for someone nearing childbirth, a scrap of cloth tied tight to stop a child's fever. She had 3 siblings. Tomás, older by a few years, was the slow stone of the family, steady, reserved, a man whose face learned to keep its sorrow in the jaw. Davi, younger, kept laughter like contraband. He could make a tired child grin with a joke or a ridiculous face, but his jokes hid an anger that did not always know how to shape itself into words. Madalena was the smallest of them, hair dark and glossy, eyes like the first wet season, soft and quick to trust. Together they made a fragile constellation, and Clara's promise braided them into something like safety. Cândida would be the one to hold them close. The farm's household was run by Baron Henrique de Souza and his wife, the Baroness. From the house, the polished table, silver that never lost its sheen, and linen that smelled faintly of starch, commands flowed down like water from a cistern. They rarely went near the Senzala without orders. Distance served the Baron's peace of mind. Power on the ground was exercised by 3 made men, Antonio, Ricardo, and Paulo, the fighter class, the overseers who kept the order the Baron's ledger required. Each overseer carried a personality as distinct as the tools they favored. Antonio had a sour attentiveness, a look that lingered where it should not. Ricardo kept to the sheds and the tools. His presence smelled of oil and rope. Paulo was quieter, older in a way that made his silence feel like a reserve, someone who thought twice before speaking, and whose twice was never merely a reflex. Cândida watched them all. Her eyes catalogued routines and cracks. She learned which overseer woke with a hangover and which one returned from the house tender with a scowl. She memorized the Baron's schedule, the days he ate in the dining room, the times his wagon left for town. Survival on São Benedito was about information and about the art of moving beneath notice, of being useful enough to be spared suspicion and invisible enough to hide what mattered. Life on the farm was a ledger of small, constant labors. Dawn came with the bell. Hands fanned coals for the morning coffee. The grindstone sang. Women bent over piles of beans, sorting the bad grains from those that would fetch a price. Children followed older ones in line like echoes. The kitchen was Cândida's territory, the place where she kept what she could afford of care. Her hands were skilled at stretching a meager soup until it fed 4 mouths. She was watchful not only because of the promise, but because the work of care had forged her into a person who anticipated need. Her watchfulness was not merely protective. It was the only strategy she had left to make sure Tomas could stand, Davy could laugh, Madalena could sleep without the dread that came from men who waited at the edge of things. For years the farm maintained a contemptuous rhythm. Labor, punishment, little mercies, grief. The Baron's ledger balanced because others shouldered the weight. A whip could erase a row of coffee. A single favor could buy a Sabbath's respite. In that calculus, dignity was never priced. Still, people on São Benedito found ways to make life. Music during work, whispered stories at night about places beyond the forest, prayers repeated until the syllables were worn smooth. And then, because the world is neither fair nor blind, attention turned in the direction that always cost something. Antonio's eyes left the field and began to rest on Madalena. At first it was a look that could be dismissed as the passing fancy of a man with more power than sense. He lingered at the fence a moment longer when Madalena walked by. He made excuses that placed him near the Cenzala at sunset with honeyed talk and promises no one asked for. He said he had a cousin in town who could make her a dress. To the Baron's authority, these were small transgressions. To Cândida, they were a hazard that risked everything. Cândida did what every person who still believed in the rules tried to do. She appealed to those who, by name and title, held responsibility. She approached the house, skirt folded close, hands steady against the sun-hot tin bowl she carried. She spoke to the Baroness first. In the cool, shadowed parlour, the Baroness's life was lived behind lace curtains and polite indifference. Her answer was a practiced shrug. "We don't mix matters," the Baroness said, meaning she would not conflate personal impropriety with the inconveniences that keep the house running. The Baron listened with a hand on the back of a chair and offered a statement about order and property that sounded like doctrine until Cândida recognized its intent: to avoid trouble. They were not troublemakers by the Baron's terms. They were commodities whose value the Baron's mind understood as a sum. A complaint might reduce their market worth. It might diminish a handsome selling price in a future pinch. So the household's version of justice was a ledger entry, and compassion was measured in the slender currency of discretion. Tomas, who had always preferred to make a path with his shoulders rather than with his voice, stepped into the defense of his sister one slow afternoon when Antonio's hand brushed too close. He said a thing fierce and brief, more a shove than a speech. The overseer's response was swift. Tomas was stripped down to a shirtless memory of skin and bone and made to bend over the trough while a line of men watched. The punishment was a ritual intended to reassert hierarchy, a public demonstration meant to remind everyone how small they must appear to be kept in place. The lashes cut in a way that left the record of indignity long after the bleeding stopped. The shame that the field accepted would not be written down in any ledger of worth. Davy did not wait for rules. He answered violence with clumsy courage. He struck once in the night-time, a poor attempt at a retaliation that was not strategy so much as wrath. The reply, when it came, arrived like weather. One morning the Cenzala woke to the news that Davy had been found dead. The Baron's statement called it an accident. A fall from a sugar mill not properly guarded, the official word said, careful to make the record clean. In the Cenzala, people knew when words were made to hold a lie. They folded that lie up like a cloth and carried it with them. Davy's death shifted something in Cândida that years of hardship had not dented. Where grief had been a dull ache, it became a lodestone of cold, determined thought. He had been younger than she had imagined, and now he would not laugh again. His burial was without ceremony by the house's terms, a few hands to lower him into the red earth, a place at the margin where proper people did not look. Names were sometimes not even allowed at a burial. To not record was to ensure the balance of property did not tilt. Those small indignities learned in a single hour could not be unlearned. The morning after the burial, the bell tolled as if nothing had happened. People moved like ghosts through their assigned tasks. Cândida's promise, the one sewn into her at the market with Clara's breath on her hair, repelled all illusions of patience. She had kept the family together for 20 years by listening, by learning, by giving what she could. Davy's death made clear that listening was no longer enough. The promise she had carried was not merely a vow against separation. It had become a clause in a contract with survival. She could not allow Madalena to be taken as commodity, not while Tomas and she drew breath. This is where a story becomes a problem that must measure its own stakes. Resistance on São Benedito could take many forms: flight, petition, small crimes of cunning, or an act that the world would call violence. Each path held costs. Flight was perilous and required resources. Petition had been tried and failed. Cândida thought of the Baron's ledger as a trap. Every attempt to use the system to protect the family only tightened the invisible screw. She began to move in quieter ways. Her mind, which years of rationing and care had made precise catalogued opportunities, like items on a kitchen shelf. Paulo, the overseer whose silence held thought like a cocoon, was her one small door. He had years on him, and a face that had learned to be careful. The men of São Benedito all had reasons for their choices. They were not monsters without motives, but people who had traded pieces of their souls for survival in a cruel economy. Paulo's quietness came from seeing where the noise led. Once, in the shed, their hands brushed on the same rafter, and a wordless understanding passed. He saw some things and looked away. He had seen more than he admitted. This made him vulnerable and, to Cândida, useful. She did not pretend to be optimistic about changing him. Instead, she appealed to the small remnant of humanity people like Paulo carried, if only to keep a part of themselves decent. The scales that tipped a man were complicated: years, threats, debts, and stray acts of kindness. Cândida gave him what did not cost her much: cotton thread repaired neatly, a piece of bread, and a nod that said she saw him, and he, in turn, offered information. The Baron's absence on certain nights, the pattern of the overseer's rounds where the dogs slept, which gate was propped a fraction open at noon. It was not allegiance, it was a trade in subtleties. Every plan demands tools. The tool that would become the story's bluntest symbol was a machete, a long, honest blade that belonged to the land as much as to its keeper. It was a thing of necessity on a coffee farm, a blade to clear vines, to cut stalks, to shape the world to human need. Cândida thought of the machete not as an instrument of murder, but as an extension of labor, a hand becoming metal that could also be a hinge between life and death. She bought two in her mind, and then in action. Theft on São Benedito was a small high-risk economy, and she traded things she could spare: extra cups of grain, a few favors paid by kindness, for a pair of blades hidden in the underflooring of the kitchen where the hearth smoke made searchers less likely to look. She sharpened them in secret. Whetstone and water changed a dull edge into something that could cut sugarcane and also, if fate demanded, cut threat. The act of sharpening had a ritual to it: long, patient strokes, a focus on a steady hand. It was the opposite of the urgent violence that would later be thrust into the telling. Sharpening was an exercise in patience and the flattening of fear into something functional. Each pass of stone to metal rang like a small bell inside her chest, an attempt to turn memory into action. Before the blades came days of reconnaissance. Cândida walked the farm at times, when light bent and shadows lengthened, cataloguing the positions men took when the lamp was low. She counted steps from the tool shed to the creek, measured in her head the distance from the kitchen door to the back gate, noted how the moon threw silver lines across the field. She taught Tomás and Madalena a code of small gestures, a pull on a hem, the flick of the wrist, that would mean go without giving a word to the air. They practiced as quietly as children learn prayers: a signal, a run, a place to meet. The owl was their code. Its call at night, sharp and solitary, would mean move. The owl was predator and omen both. Its cry would put terror into the hearts of dogs and also into the practiced habit of men who knew to listen when birds spoke differently. Paulo's reports were precise. He told them where the Baron's men kept an extra lamp for late-night revelry and which path a rider took when he went into town. These were fragments of a map. They arranged the pieces like a woman arranging beans by size until the pattern made sense. They did not tell everyone. Each secret cost them trust elsewhere, but Cândida could not risk too many confidants. Trust, in the wrong places, is a tax that history levies. At night, in the shadowed kitchen, Cândida taught Tomás and Madalena how to move without making a floorboard betray them. She taught them to breathe slow when the dogs barked and to avoid the places where footstools squeaked. Tomás practiced with a gravity that hid his fear like a stone hidden under cloth. Madalena, with smaller steps, learned to keep her laugh tight in her chest. They spoke little. The plan required less talk than resolve. All the while, Cândida kept remembering Clara's grip and voice, the promise that had seamed itself to her ribs and become almost a second heart. It was strange to feel that tether extend beyond 2 decades, pressed into the features of each day like a watermark. The memory of the market where Clara had been parted from whatever life she had carried before lived in Cândida's mouth like old sugar, bitter and sweet at once. She had been a child then, and the market was a world of noise and fear. That moment when Clara leaned close and asked for a vow was an act of transfer, not only of duty, but of faith. Clara had no power to fight a market. What she could do was ask that someone hold the family together, and Cândida carried that ask like an heirloom, not shiny or easy but steadfast. This promise did not exist abstractly. It had effects on how Cândida ate, how she disciplined a child's fear, and whom she chose to meet with her eyes. It demanded that she think in longer arcs than one human lifetime allowed. It required sacrifices that every careful mind enumerates in sleepless hours. It also made her question the morality of any path that traded one life for another. The promise was both a map and a boundary. She would do anything to keep the siblings together, but it had to be a plan that left them whole. The calculus of survival sometimes demanded an impossible balance, to take what is necessary to secure others and to accept the moral weight that such an action would carry. There were nights when she imagined alternatives. Flight to the Quilombo, the community of freedom-seekers living in the forest. These places were spoken of in the hushed languages of those who longed to step out of the ledger's shadow. Quilombos represented safety beyond the Baron's fences, communities where people who had escaped the farms had rebuilt lives, connected by kin and memory. Historically, Quilombos were refugee and resistance, communities built by those seeking to live free from the plantation's calculations. The distance to such a place from São Benedito was a matter of rumor and breath. Practical details like routes and who guarded which path were often indefinido. To travel there required timing and courage and people ready to move when the dark was thick enough to hold them. In the end, she weighed flight against direct action. Flight could save some, but not all. It demanded a journey that might split them up. Direct action might buy a chance to escape together, but came with the greatest danger. The choice did not feel like daring. It felt like arithmetic performed by hands that had grown used to counting wrongs. Each time Cândida touched the whetstone, she felt the tally shift under her fingers. She learned to speak the language of small, decisive gestures. The owl, the whetstone, the hidden blades, these were not speeches but tools. She practiced moving with a machete beneath her apron until it felt like a part of her body. There are moments when survival demands that hands which had stirred porridge become instruments of defense. It was in that transformation that Cândida recognized how much of herself she was willing to lay down. Rumors spread along the plantation like smoke. Whispers of a plan ricocheted from one kitchen to another, sifted down the line of people who worked the same rows. Some believed, others turned away, and a few folded their eyes to the ground with the kind of despair that said they had seen too much to hope. But even silence had its own noise, the quietness of those who pretended to sleep, the false laughter at night that hid a mind waking to the shape of consequence. There was a night when the sky closed in like a fist, the leaves slapping against each other in the press of coming rain. Cândida sat on the lower step of the kitchen, the whetstone in a basin, water like a mirror in the stone. Her hands moved the blade slowly, the sound of metal on stone a thin, almost religious scrape. She thought of Clara's hand in hers, and then of Davy's buried back. She thought of Tomás's stoic face, and Madalena's small, trusting breath beside her when she slept. She counted actions instead of breaths and chose each one. She finished sharpening as thunder began far off, and the farm smelled of wet earth. Tomás slipped from the cenzala, silent and alert. In the moment before she wrapped the blades in oilcloth, she realized that the promise had become something that could not simply be kept the way one keeps a photograph in an album. It needed to be paid in ways that could be seen and felt. The blade was not a symbol alone, it would be a lever. They rehearsed the code again. Owl call, a single feather placed on the kitchen door latch, a small notch on the wooden post by the creek. Laughter was forbidden then. There was only the hush of resolve. For the first time in a long time, Cândida felt the old quiet in her chest shift into something like clarity. She was no longer only keeper of pots and small comforts. She was the holder of a covenant, and covenants have demands. Outside the range of the kitchen's low roof, the farm continued to move. Dogs rolled in the veranda's shade, and far off the Baron's carriage wheels made their appointed sound on the main road. The bell still existed and tolled, indifferent to the particularity of any plan. A bell tells hours. A bell also counts the lives pressed under its ring. Paolo promised to look away on one chosen night and to leave a gate propped at its narrowest slant. He did not promise more. Cândida did not expect more. Relying on the softer parts of men had always been an uneasy business. Yet the small favours came, a note tucked beneath a plank, a nod that said when the Baron's supper would run long. Cândida turned these bits into a net that could catch them if anything came untied. The plan was not poetry. It was a practical thing chewed into shape. Strike where the overseers were most exposed, create a symbol to unseat pretend security, and use the chaos to move out into the forest where the Quilombo might receive them. The plan also kept a fierce morality at its center, no needless cruelty, no spectacle of vengeance. A life ended would not be celebrated. It would be acknowledged as the bleak arithmetic of survival. That was the moral framework Cândida set for herself, to shield her people and to take responsibility for the act. As the first rain struck the earth in a thin, refreshing hiss, she wrapped the blades and set them in the hollow in the kitchen floor she had carved years before to hide small things. The whetstone she slid back into the hearth's shadow. She taught Maddalena, who could not know something like death in full, how to keep her shoulders low and her eyes on the ground. Tomás, whose silence had been a fortress and whose grief now had begun to be a fire, practiced holding something heavy and not letting it fall. They agreed on a meeting place in the forest, a burned stump they called the marker, where the light broke through the canopy in a manner that made the dark seem less dangerous because it had a pattern. They agreed too on what to leave behind. Clara's handkerchief, kept folded, would be the talisman of memory. If they had to separate, the handkerchief would move with them, a constant in an otherwise scattered existence. That evening Cândida walked to the edge of the plantation, where the trail narrowed and the wild began. She let the rain bead on her skin and listened for the owl. The call did not come yet. She thought of the machete planted in the Baron's table, the symbol, she imagined, not to compel the Baron's conscience, which would remain unmoved, but to make visible a claim. The act would be loud and dangerous. It would also be clear in its message that the balance of things on São Benedito had been broken, and the reason was not petty revenge, but a promise fulfilled in the only currency left. She did not sleep that night. She sat with the tools and the plan and with maps of movement in her head. She hummed a song Clara used to sing, one line that had been repeated at births and at sudden storms. Keep them. The song was not a spell. It was a scaffold. As the first wash of night settled like cloth, Cândida checked the oilcloth wrapping and slid it into a hidden fold beneath the floorboards, where the smoke made the wood darker and less likely to show a fresh scrape. Tomás crouched nearby, his jaw set like something that would not surrender. Maddalena pressed her small hand into Cândida's and refused to let go. Outside, the farm's dogs barked at nothing, a nervous chorus that had known too many human tragedies. In the house, the Baron's laughter rose like the clink of glasses. Power and possession dined on the same table that had never known a complaint it could not buy off. Cândida felt the world around her as if a curtain was being drawn tighter. In her chest, the promise she had carried for 20 years began to thrum like a wound that would not heal unless tended. She did not tell herself that the next morning would arrive with victory. She told herself that promises cannot remain words while the world keeps biting. A promise, in her reckoning, was a thing that needed payment. Sometimes the price was survival. Sometimes it was a life taken to buy other lives. She tried to hold that fact with sorrow and with purpose. At a late hour, when the rain slowed to a hush and the night animals resumed their small conversations, Cândida crept outside and listened hard for the owl. The farm exhaled. Somewhere beyond the coffee trees the forest breathed too. The owl's call could make men think of omens, and dogs could be silenced by its tone. It was a small, secret language with the power to move a body from one place to another without words. She waited. If the owl called, the plan would move from thought into motion. If it did not, they would have to wait for another night, another opening. Either way, the promise that had been given in a market's dust 2 decades earlier had become more than a memory. It had become a plan, sharpened, wrapped, and heavy with consequence. She held that weight like a compass, turning her face toward the forest and the uncertain, brave idea of a life beyond the Baron's hands. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing, so voices like Cândida's are not forgotten. When the owl finally called, its note cut through the rain and the low churn of the farm like a thin blade. The sound dropped into the warm, wet air and pulled at the edges of every shadow. Cândida rose from the step where she had sat and laid her hand over Tomas's and Madalena's as if they were an answer she could keep pressing into place. The moment was small, private, and immense, an animal's cry cupped into human resolve. They moved with the quiet of those who have practiced silence as a craft. Tomas led. Madalena kept close, the handkerchief Clara had given them pressed into her fist. Cândida carried the oilcloth bundle under the hem of her apron, feeling the weight of its folded metal like a secret heartbeat. The dog kennels were dark. The cook's lantern had been left to gutter on the far stoop where it could be seen from the road, an oversight that had been left deliberately as part of Paulo's plan. A gate lay half-propped, where a last storm had knocked at the hinges. The path they took threaded between coffee trees, whose leaves winked with raindrops and over mud that held no honest footprints. The first strike happened where shadows pooled thickest, in the tool shed behind the main barn, where Ricardo kept oilskins and rope and a heavy iron hook that clung to the air with the smell of oil. He was a man who thought the shed gave him a kind of safe authority. He worked by tools and numbers, and believed most of what he did could be explained to his ledger. That evening he was alone, counting nails as if they were futures to be rationed. He did not hear Tomas until Tomas spoke. The exchange was small, a confrontation meant to immobilize rather than to invite sound. Cândida stood where the doorway threw a rectangle of rain light, machete steady beneath her shawl like a limb she had grown into. Ricardo lunged for his knife, a reflex of a man who kept a blade across his belt. Tomas moved like a slow thing made swift. The clash of bodies knocked loose the shed's smell of metal. A single stroke, measured and terrible, ended the scuffle before it could be shouted into the compound. When it was over, Cândida sat against the wall and breathed mud into the ribs of the night. The tool shed smelled of rain and oil, and the absence of the man who had thought himself invulnerable. They did not celebrate. They wrapped him the way you wrap a storm. You do not touch the fulcrum, you let it lie where it fell. The plan had always been to strike where the overseers were most vulnerable, and then to make a claim that would be seen. The claim was not a boast, it was a punctuation. Cândida's machete would be the sentence. She walked, leading her siblings, as the underwood thickened, and the farm's lights retreated into a thin cluster near the house. When they reached the creek, Antonio was there, either by design or by the blindness of a man who thought nothing would happen to him in the dark. Antonio moved fast when he realized he was being watched. He smelled of old beer and the sour attentiveness of a man who had practiced predation. He was cunning in the way he tried to bargain, words like oil, meant to make a sliding easier for his intentions. Cândida spoke to him in the same tight language she had used at the Baron's house. No entreaties of justice, only the facts that pressed under the night's weight. He stepped toward Madalena as if he had not been part of a long line of men who thought the law of the plantation permitted any hunger to be satisfied by a body not his own. The creek was a narrow ribbon of water that moved with a cold argument against the banks. It made the ground close and the trees arch in conspiracy. Cândida lured Antonio a few paces ahead with a movement that mimicked the shy of a small animal. She did not hate him in the frantic, vengeful way songs sometimes promise. She hated the fact of the system he represented, the ledger that declared other people expendable so that men could sleep. When the instant came, she moved with the same decisive motion that seasons a life of quiet labor. a clean action performed with the economy of one who had learned to prize the result over the theatrics of feeling. Nothing about their departure was loud enough to be hailed as victory. There was only breathing and the low slap of mud on leather. The machetes were placed briefly into the earth as if to mark that this ground had been claimed by deeds rather than names. Then Cândida walked the long way back toward the house, her palms raw under the cloth, the skin of her hands remembering the whetstone's wet patience. The house was dark, except for a lantern in the dining room, where Baron Henrique had not retired as early as usual. The table there was long and polished the way prosperity sometimes smooths over conscience. Cândida paused at the door that separated the world, traded in ledgers, from the world that kept people's lives. She did not go to the Baron's bed to demand anything. That would have been spectacle, and spectacle was dangerous. Instead, she left the machete planted upright in the table, the iron half buried, the handle pointing at the doorway like a question. It was a symbol and a claim. It said, "You can no longer pretend your home was separate from the ledger you keep, where your silver sits. Blood and promise have touched." In the morning, the sound of the planted blade became a rumor that thudded through São Benedito like a distant drum. The Baron's household woke to chaos. Horses were saddled in haste. Men who had slept through seasons of cruelty learned to move faster than they had ever thought necessary. The overseer's absence became a blank his ledger could not easily explain. The gates opened like a mouth to swallow the names of those who tried to flee. Cândida had counted on confusion to be the thing that gave movement time. She had not counted on the absolute speed with which the Baron's power could mobilize a pursuit. Mounted men rode with the mechanical patience of people who had practiced hunting human beings. Dogs were loosened with teeth and noses trained to read the faint history of fear in a footprint. They ran like people with pedigree to resolve and no claim to luck. Tomás carried as much of Madalena's weight as he could when the mud thickened at the foot of the second rise. Cândida's breath was a measured thing. She listened for the sound of hoof on earth like a barometer of danger. They fell into the forest's arms, where paths unrolled with the slow generosity of nature. The Quilombo lay unnamed in rumor, but known in the pressings of many tongues, a place where people who had left the plantations had learned to be their own. It was the hope they had chased across nights and plans, not a guarantee, but a direction. Pursuit narrowed and then closed. A man with matted hair and a noble's whip cried order behind them. The dogs baying cut through the tree line. Cândida could feel the net tightening like a vice. In that narrowing she understood what the choice would ask of her. The promise Clara had given her did not merely demand keeping them together in name. It demanded ensuring that at least some among them might survive to carry the story forward. The calculus was cruel and precise. She made the choice as she had always made hard things, in small, deliberate turns. "You two go," she said, voice flat and close to the ground, handing Madalena's hand to Tomás. Her words were not a plea. They were a transaction, safety in exchange for time. Tomás's face tightened. He argued with silence and a grief so fierce it could not be named. Madalena's eyes filled with a confusion that had not yet learned the full grammar of loss. She clutched the handkerchief until the cloth wrinkled. Cândida pressed the oilcloth into Tomás's palms, the blades a heavy, terrible talisman. "Do not look back," she said. It was not a command only to their bodies. It was a release so that her image would not be the last thing they carried into the Quilombo. They ran. Cândida turned her back toward the moonlit path and met the first of the riders as if she had been waiting. She moved through the brush in the way she had moved through every day, with care for the small things that would keep one alive. When the dogs came, she scattered them with a handful of stew bones she had kept spilth in preparation. When the first rider loomed, she met him not with a stolen blade, but with the thing that would make him stop. A human presence that did not flinch from the fact of his hunger. He raised a weapon that would punish her for refusing to be property. And then another came, and a rope looped about her wrist like a question turned into fact. They fought. They were not actors in a glorious tableau. They were living beings trading blows with the cost of the family on their shoulders. A horse's hoof struck, a rope flayed. Cândida felt pain, but also the clarity of the choice she had made. She had not sought the fight for herself. She had accepted it for the purpose of buying distance with blood. The pursuers were surprised by the ferocity of a woman who had spent 20 years learning to make the small economy of care resist the violence of profit. When the capture happened, it was not with the prohibition of dignity. They bound her hands and dragged her to the path's edge. Tomás and Madalena were already gone, swallowed by green and fear, and the direction toward a promise's refuge. Cândida's breath began to move like a thread in the wind. Men came close to gloat, to extract meaning, but the plantation knight's cruelty was a practiced thing. It did not know how to hold the sight of someone who had chosen to make a claim with the seriousness of a stone. The riders had their orders: return the captive, make a spectacle, reassert control. They brought Cândida to the clearing near the house so that the Baron might see the object lesson he requested. She walked with feet that still had the rhythm of the kitchen, the way to hold the body steady while the world tried to break it. The Baron's face read fury like a ledger that had been disturbed. He did not ask questions that mattered. He wanted the right seal of precedent. The overseers told a story the way papers record an asset, how violence had been necessary to preserve order. They called Cândida a criminal in words that stripped the complexity from their own culpability. Ritual punishment followed like clockwork, words spoken by men who had practiced moral shapes that fit their ledger. There was shouting and the flapping of coarse coats. A whip cracked. Cândida felt the sting, as if it were an old worry poked into present skin. Pain, yes, but not the worst of it. The worst of it was the thought that she had not been able to keep every single person she loved from harm. But she had kept what mattered most. The promise that Clara had made was not reduced to a piece of paper. It had become action. A man shoved a lance too close, and something happened that blurred into the noise. A rider overreached. An animal panicked. A gun went off as if accidental. The wound they inflicted was severe. They carried her then into a low room that smelled of iron and old wood, and the lemon soap the Baron kept for the table linens. Men stood in clusters and whispered about law and property. Her body refused to obey the part of speech that had made life possible. They talked like accountants until the world blurred at the edges. In the low light, she thought of Clara's hand again. Small bones and a voice that had used its last breath to delegate care. She thought of the market where names had been traded for coin. Memory arrived in her like weather, sudden and absolute. She had bought 2 futures with 1 life. That fact sat over her like both a relief and an indictment. She did not romanticize what she had done. She weighed each action the way one weighs grain. She had cut threads to make the tapestry possible for those she loved. Tomás and Madalena reached the Quilombo with lungs full of fear and an ache that would not leave their bones. They entered a community made of many small houses pressed into the forest, a place where cooking smoke wrote daily news into the sky, and where songs had learned to hold both mourning and stubborn hope. Elders received them in the way the world sometimes gives shelter, neither a miracle nor a guarantee, but a room where the wound could be dressed and a name could be given. The Quilombo offered shelter for the night and the beginning of new work, fields to guard, communal meals to share, a bed beneath a roof that had no ledger. There by the stump they'd chosen as a marker, they folded Clara's handkerchief into a pocket and called the name of the woman who had been their center. The elders listened. Their ears were memory boards. They took the story and pulsed it into the community's breath, making sure Cândida's name would not be swallowed into silence. Names were the thing Quilombos kept as a defiance. Here lived people who could speak and still be whole. Back at São Benedito, the Baron's house returned to its outward order. There were rumors, declarations of law, and the customary attempt to sanitize a bad accounting. The ledger was mended where it mattered, not by justice, but by force and denial. Official records would never note the weight of what had been done. Men who enforced systems do not usually leave their own conscience on the table. They leave stories in the mouths of those who have to live them. Cândida's last moments were simple in the way that ultimate things often are. She had been moved to the house's storage room, where old tablecloths smelled like vinegar, and the bed was a pallet meant for servants, not masters. Someone brought her a bowl of lukewarm soup, and because people are awkward in the presence of pain, gestures became their way of trembling kindness. She expected fear. Instead, she felt a steadiness that belonged to the fact that she had done what she had promised to do. The ache in her lungs was a ledger, too, an honest accounting. In the dim, she thought of Tomás and Madalena running through a forest that had the crooked generosity of new life. She thought of Clara and the market, and the way hands could pass duty like a relic. Her last breath carried the memory of children's laughter and the sharp ring of the whetstone. She saw in her mind the image of the machete planted in the Baron's table, not as an act of bravado, but as a mark, a punctuation that read, "We counted, and not in your way." She closed her eyes with a few folded thoughts. That promises are burdens, but also maps. That you can pay for freedom with what you have. That the record of a life is not only what governments write, but what people remember. The Quilombo made space for the promise to live. Tomás and Madalena grew into roles that kept memory alive and practical. Tomás, whose silence had once been a defensive wall, learned to speak in small circles, to teach others how to move in the forest and to tend the shared fields. Madalena kept Clara's handkerchief in her hair for a long time, a talisman stitched into the daily work. The elders told Cândida's story in the way that communities pass wisdom, not as an epic that masks its sorrow, but as a repeated truth used to teach prudence and courage. In time, the story of São Benedito became a tale carried down trailways and river crossings. It might be changed in details by those who told it. Some would emphasize the courage, others the loss, but the core remained. A vow given in a market was kept across 20 years by a woman who translated a promise into an action that altered 3 lives. What the official ledgers never recorded was the shape of the debt repaid, the siblings' survival, a name uttered where it might otherwise have been lost, a machete in a table that marked a boundary. Context. Quilombos were communities formed by people who escaped enslavement and sought to live autonomously. They varied widely in size and organization, often sustaining themselves through agriculture, shared labor, and mutual defense. Their existence in the 19th century represented both a refusal of plantation logic and a practical response to the possibility of life beyond enforced labor. Exact details, distances from specific farms, routes taken by escapees, or the political recognition of particular quilombos, are often indefinido in specific episodes of individual histories, but their role as refugees and centers of cultural resilience is well documented. There are quieter reckonings that do not appear on public ledgers, families within the Quilombo, and those who stayed behind in the shadow of plantations kept the memory of Cândida alive in songs hummed over planting and in the small ritual of touching a handkerchief before a journey. Children learned the cadence of the owl call and listened to elders speak of choice and consequence in the way of people who wanted the past not to be an anchor, but a lesson. Years later, when Tomás taught children where to aim a sling and how to read the weather by the curl of the coffee leaf, he would sometimes look at the horizon and think of a table with a blade planted in it. He would tell himself that it had been a wound and a claim both, that a single night had shattered a comfortable silence because the silence protected a cruelty. He taught the children not to imitate the violence, but to understand the desperate arithmetic that could make a person choose it. History, as recorded, did not offer Cândida a place among the free. Official records rarely granted dignity where it would alter the balance of property and power. Yet within the Quilombo and the families that carried her story, she was not simply an absence. She was a lineage. Names were passed, not as trophies but as maps. The children who learned her story were taught the difference between revenge and survival, between anger that consumes and resolve that protects. And so memory did what laws would not. It kept the ledger honest in a way that accounting never could. The promise Clara had made in a market's dust lived on, not as a line on a paper, but as a thread woven into midwives' bags and into the way people taught their children to hold hands while crossing paths. It was a reminder that promises given in the small chambers of desperation could be kept in strange, terrible ways, and that sometimes the currency of love is paid in acts no law is willing to witness. Cândida's story remained a complicated thing in the mouth of those who told it. Not a simple hymn to valor, but a sober, aching lesson about what systems demand and how people answer. Her act did not exonerate the plantation economy, nor did it give a moral template for others to follow. It was instead a human response to an inhuman calculus. In the long arc of those who survived, the siblings found a way to keep the promise alive, by living, teaching, and naming. The Quilombo's elders would insist that they teach the children to remember the market's dust, the sound of the bell, and the weight of a hand squeezed tight. Memory, they said, was a kind of freedom that no ledger could purchase. If this story moved you, share it to honor lives the records erased and consider subscribing to keep listening to History Reclaimed.